A black man, known for his calm demeanor and sharp mind, had spent years honing his skills and understanding the dynamics of human behavior. He was no stranger to injustice, having experienced it firsthand throughout his life. As a child, he'd witnessed how certain people were treated differently because of the color of their skin. Now as an adult, he had become an expert in exposing discrimination, working undercover to gather evidence that would help bring change. This time the mission was different. The target was a luxury store in the heart of a bustling city, known not just for its high-end products but also for its racist reputation. The man's mission was clear: go undercover in the store, gather proof of the owner's discriminatory actions, and expose it to the world. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about dismantling a system that allowed racist practices to continue without consequence. The store's owner was a well-known figure, always at the center of the city's elite circles. He'd built his business from the ground up, but his success came at a cost. It was widely whispered that the store had a history of treating black customers poorly. The staff, it seemed, had been trained to turn a blind eye to people of color. The man had already heard enough stories from others who'd been treated unfairly. Now it was his turn to see it firsthand. The man didn't take this assignment lightly. He knew he had to be careful, especially when dealing with someone so powerful and influential. His plan was simple: enter the store like any other customer, blend in with the crowd, and observe how the staff treated him. He had to act natural without drawing any suspicion. The more unnoticed he was, the more likely he was to gather the evidence he needed. As he prepared for his mission, he carefully chose his outfit. He wanted to appear as a potential customer, someone with the means to shop at a high-end store, but not someone so flashy that he would stand out. He opted for a smart jacket and a pair of well-polished shoes. He made sure to keep his demeanor calm, avoiding any signs of aggression or frustration. His goal was to stay composed and professional, no matter what he encountered. The next morning, he made his way to the store. The building itself was impressive, towering over the street with its sleek glass windows and luxurious displays. As he stepped inside, the contrast between the outside world and the store's interior was striking. Everything was pristine, from the polished floors to the gleaming shelves filled with expensive handbags, watches, and clothing. It was clear that money and status defined this place. The man took a deep breath and began to walk through the aisles, acting as if he were just another affluent customer looking to make a purchase. At first, everything seemed normal. The staff, dressed in crisp uniforms, nodded politely as he passed by. He didn't feel any hostility, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't long before he noticed the subtle difference in how the staff treated him, compared to other customers. A group of well-dressed white patrons was browsing nearby, and the staff seemed to attend to them with an air of respect, offering assistance and engaging in friendly conversation. But when the man moved closer to a section of designer jackets, the staff suddenly became distant, avoiding eye contact and refusing to offer help. He tried not to let it bother him. This was part of the plan, after all. He had to observe and gather as much information as possible. But as the minutes ticked by, the discomfort grew. It wasn't just the coldness from the staff. It was the look in the owner's eyes when he spotted the man standing in the store. The owner, a middle-aged white man with neatly combed hair, was watching from across the room. Their eyes met for just a second, and the man could feel the hostility radiating from the owner. He had seen that look before, the kind of look that seemed to judge you based on your appearance alone, without knowing anything about who you were or where you came from. The man tried to remain calm, knowing that any sign of anger or frustration could blow his cover. He decided to walk toward the back of the store, pretending to look at some of the pricier items. He could feel the owner's eyes still on him, tracking his every move. The tension in the air was thick, and the man could tell that something was about to happen. Suddenly, the owner made his move. He walked over to the man with a forced smile on his face, but there was no mistaking the dismissive tone in his voice. "Can I help you, sir?" the owner asked, his words dripping with condescension. The man knew right away that the owner had already decided who he was based on nothing more than his skin color. "I'm just browsing," the man replied calmly, trying to keep the situation as neutral as possible. He didn't want to escalate things, not yet. But the owner wasn't satisfied. He stepped even closer, his tone growing sharper. "I don't think you can afford anything in here," he said, loud enough for a few nearby customers to hear. The man was taken aback, but he didn't let the words affect him. He had heard worse, but it still stung. The owner's attitude was unmistakable. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a pattern of behavior. The man had seen it many times before. Wealthy individuals who felt entitled to treat others like they were beneath them. But this time the man had a purpose. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He had a mission to complete, and he was determined to see it through. Without responding to the owner's rude remark, the man turned and walked toward the exit. But just as he was about to leave, the owner's voice called out behind him. "I think you should leave," the owner said, his words sharp and final. "We don't allow people like you in here." The man paused for a moment, taking in the gravity of the situation. He had expected something like this, but hearing it aloud still hurt. He didn't react, though. He simply nodded and walked out of the store, his mind racing with the injustice he had just witnessed. As he stepped outside, he felt a wave of frustration and anger wash over him. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had been treated the same way, dismissed and dehumanized simply because of the color of their skin. He knew he had to take action. This mission wasn't just a job, it was a chance to expose the truth and make a difference. He left the store that day knowing that he had seen enough. The owner's actions were blatant and the evidence was clear. It was time to take the next step and gather more proof. The man's mission had just begun, and he wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. The following day, the man knew he had to go back. His mind raced with thoughts of what had happened, and he realized that leaving things unfinished would be a mistake. He had already witnessed the owner's racism firsthand, but to truly make an impact, he needed more proof, more evidence that could not be ignored. His mission wasn't just about showing the world what had happened to him. It was about exposing a pattern of discrimination that affected others, too. He had learned a lot the previous day, the way the staff acted, how the owner treated him, and how they didn't even try to hide their biases. But he needed to be smarter about how he approached things this time. He knew that if he didn't tread carefully, it could all fall apart. The stakes were higher now. He needed to gather more damning evidence, and he had to do it without drawing attention. The man spent the night preparing for his return. He didn't want to make the same mistakes as before. He knew that his first visit had been an instinctual response to being treated unfairly, but now it was time to be strategic. He had to blend in even more, be invisible to the staff, and record every detail without anyone noticing. His role in this situation wasn't just as a victim. He was now a witness, an investigator, and a messenger who had a mission to complete. When he walked through the store doors again, everything looked the same. The polished floors, the expensive displays, and the sleek high-end products still held their place, showcasing a world of luxury and elegance. But the man knew better. Behind the polished image there was something darker, something that people like him had experienced for far too long. He took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was here. He moved through the aisles with a calm demeanor, pretending to be just another well-to-do customer. This time he made sure to blend in even more, walking slowly and carefully as if deciding between products. He didn't want to give anyone a reason to question his presence. But as he walked deeper into the store, it was clear that his presence was already having an effect. The staff once again seemed to take notice of him. He saw them exchanging glances, the subtle shift in their body language as they observed him from afar. The man knew that his cover wouldn't last long. He couldn't remain invisible forever, not when the staff was this aware of him. But his patience paid off when he spotted one of the store employees, a woman in her 20s dressed in the store's uniform, approaching a nearby display. The man decided to test the waters. He casually walked up to her, pretending to be interested in a high-end watch that was on display. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice steady and calm. "Can you tell me more about this model?" The woman glanced at him, her expression neutral. She nodded, but her eyes quickly darted around the store as if she were searching for someone else to help. She spoke a few words, but it was clear that she wasn't very interested in engaging with him. It was a quick, almost dismissive response. The man, however, didn't let it faze him. He nodded, pretending to take in her explanation while all the while keeping his eyes open for any signs of the owner. It didn't take long for the owner to appear. He strode across the room with the same haughty air the man had seen the day before. His presence alone seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the store. The staff's posture straightened, their demeanor becoming more rigid. The man knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The owner was here, and with him the chance to gather more evidence. The man kept his distance, watching carefully as the owner began to interact with customers. He paid special attention to the way he treated them, looking for the subtle ways in which he might favor some and ignore others. Sure enough, the owner's behavior was exactly as the man had expected. The owner made small talk with a few white customers, smiling and laughing with them. But when the man tried to make eye contact, the owner's gaze quickly shifted elsewhere, avoiding any interaction with him. It was a pattern that the man was beginning to recognize, one that spoke volumes about the owner's attitude toward people like him. The man decided to approach the counter, where the owner was standing with a customer. As he got closer, he could feel the tension in the air. The owner's eyes briefly flicked toward him, and for a moment their gazes locked. The man didn't flinch. He simply stood there, acting as though he were considering a purchase. He knew that the owner was watching him, and he was determined to stay calm and collected. He had to play the part. This was about gathering evidence, not reacting to the owner's behavior. After a few minutes, the owner made his way toward him. The man could feel the weight of the situation growing heavier. He wasn't just a customer anymore. He was a target. The owner's smile, though polite, didn't reach his eyes. It was the same forced smile the man had seen before, the one that didn't hide the disgust the owner felt. "I haven't seen you around here before," the owner said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you sure you can afford anything here?" The man stood tall, refusing to let the owner's words get to him. "I'm just browsing," he replied, keeping his tone even and controlled. The owner scoffed, looking him up and down in a way that felt like a judgment, like a statement that wasn't based on anything except the color of his skin. The man knew what was happening. He had seen it before in other places. The store was a symbol of exclusivity, and for the owner, people like him didn't belong. He had already made his decision, and it was clear that the man wasn't welcome. As if on cue, the owner's tone shifted again, becoming more condescending. "I think you should leave," he said, louder this time so that others could hear. "We don't have anything for you here." The man's heart raced, but he didn't let his emotions show. He had been preparing for this moment, and he knew that he had to stay composed. He didn't respond to the owner's rude remark. He didn't fight back or argue. Instead, he simply turned and walked toward the door, the feeling of humiliation and anger welling up inside him. But as he left the store, a small part of him was satisfied. He had gathered more evidence, proof that the owner's behavior wasn't just a one-off incident. This was a pattern, and the world needed to see it. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, he felt a sense of determination settle in. He knew he couldn't stop now. His mission wasn't finished. It was time to take the next step, to gather the final pieces of evidence and expose the truth. He couldn't let this injustice go unchallenged, and with every step he took away from the store, he knew he was getting closer to making a real difference. The man knew that the next step in his mission was crucial. He had already seen the owner's discriminatory behavior, and he had witnessed firsthand how the store treated him differently, simply because of his skin color. But the evidence so far wasn't enough. The public needed more, something that would leave no room for doubt. He needed to be careful, though. If he was too obvious, it could all fall apart. This wasn't just about exposing the owner. It was about showing the world that this kind of behavior could no longer be accepted. The day after his second visit, the man sat at home, going through the footage he had secretly recorded. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that the owner treated him with disrespect. Still, he needed more proof, something that would expose the full extent of the store's toxic culture. The man knew that getting the footage was only half the battle. The next step was to gather more evidence, and this time, he would be more strategic about it. He spent hours reviewing his plan. He knew that he couldn't just walk in and expect things to unfold on their own. He had to be methodical. His goal was to capture the owner in action once more, but this time he needed to be even more subtle. He would have to blend in with the customers and make sure he wasn't being watched too closely. If the staff or the owner realized what he was doing, it could ruin everything. The next day, he returned to the store. This time, he was more prepared. He had a small hidden camera tucked inside his jacket, a device so discreet that it was nearly impossible to spot. His movements were smooth, practiced, and he acted like any other customer walking in to browse. The store was as pristine as ever, The high-end products on display gleamed in the light. The shelves were perfectly organized and the air was filled with the smell of luxury. But the man wasn't here to admire the products. He was here to expose the truth. He walked through the store, taking note of everything around him. The staff were busy with other customers, but he could still feel their eyes on him. He didn't let it faze him, though. He knew the best way to gather information was to be patient. He took his time, casually browsing, moving from one section of the store to the next. The longer he stayed, the more relaxed the staff would become. If he acted normal, they would think nothing of him. Eventually, the man found himself in the same section of the store where he had encountered the owner before. This was where it had all started, the moment he had been kicked out, dismissed without reason. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had to capture more footage in this exact spot, the place where the discrimination had been so evident. It felt almost symbolic. If he could catch the owner's behavior again in the same area, it would add weight to his story, showing that this was no isolated incident. He waited patiently, blending in with a group of customers who were looking at a display of designer shoes. The staff didn't seem to notice him anymore. He kept his eyes open for any sign of the owner. It didn't take long before the man spotted him, walking toward the back of the store with the same confident stride. The owner's eyes scanned the room, and for a brief moment their gazes met. The man remained calm, pretending not to notice. He knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for. As the owner walked toward him, the man's heart raced. He had to stay calm, he had to keep his cool. The last thing he wanted was to blow his cover. The owner stopped a few feet away, noticing the man for the first time. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't immediately say anything. The man could feel the tension in the air, the subtle hostility that was always present when the owner was around. The man didn't flinch. He didn't let the owner's gaze affect him. He simply smiled politely and glanced at a nearby pair of shoes, pretending to be interested in them. He could feel the owner's presence, though. He knew the man was studying him, waiting for him to make a move. But the man didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. He stayed focused on his task. After a few moments of silence, the owner spoke. "I haven't seen you in here before," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Looking to buy something or just wasting time?" The man didn't let the owner's words rattle him. "Just browsing," he replied calmly, keeping his voice steady. He could see the owner's lips curl into a smirk, a look that seemed to say, "I know who you are and you don't belong here." The man felt a rush of anger rise up inside him, but he kept it in check. This was his mission, and he had to remain professional. He couldn't let the owner get under his skin. The owner leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough so that only the man could hear. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave," he said, his words carrying the same dismissive tone the man had heard the day before. "This store isn't for people like you." For a moment, the man stood still, his breath catching in his chest. He had expected this, but it still stung. He knew that this was the moment to get the final piece of evidence he needed. The man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door, just as he had done the day before. But this time, his steps were purposeful. He wasn't just walking out of the store. He was walking out with proof. The evidence he had gathered was undeniable. The owner's racist behavior was on full display, and now he had the footage to back it up. As he stepped outside, the man's mind was already racing. He knew that he couldn't waste any time. He had to act quickly before the owner or anyone else in the store could try to cover things up. The public needed to see what was happening inside that store. He had to make sure the world knew the truth. The man headed straight for his car, his hands shaking slightly as he reviewed the footage he had just recorded. This was it. This was the evidence that would expose the store and its owner for what they truly were. The man felt a sense of relief wash over him, but he also knew that this was just the beginning. The real work was yet to come. He had to take the footage, send it to the right people, and ensure that it would reach the masses. The owner's actions couldn't go unnoticed any longer. The world had to see the truth. With the footage now securely saved on his phone, the man set his sights on the next step. He knew that this was a battle worth fighting. The store might have thought it could get away with treating people like the man had been treated, but now it was time for the truth to come to light. The man had gathered the evidence, and soon, the world would know exactly what kind of place this luxury store really was. He didn't look back as he drove away. He didn't need to. The evidence was in his hands, and he was ready to show the world what he had uncovered. The man had stayed calm and collected throughout this mission, never letting the owner's words or actions get to him. Now it was time to make sure the world saw the truth. The man knew that the next phase of his mission was going to be a turning point. He had all the evidence now, the footage, the recordings, the interactions he had experienced firsthand. It was undeniable. The store's owner had shown his true colors, and it was time to make sure the world knew what kind of place they were dealing with. He couldn't let this moment slip by. He had to act quickly, but he also had to be smart about it. As he sat in his car looking at the footage once more, he felt a wave of determination. The quiet moments of doubt and frustration had come and gone. He was no longer just a customer who had been wronged. He was a messenger, someone with the power to expose something much bigger than just a single bad experience. He thought about the countless others who had been treated poorly by the same store, the ones who hadn't been able to speak up. His mission was more than personal now. It was about bringing about change. The man didn't waste time. He uploaded the footage to a secure drive, making sure it was safe before sending it to trusted journalists, social media influencers, and activist groups who were known for standing up for social justice. He knew that if the footage reached the right people, it could cause the stir it needed to get the story out there. He was careful with whom he shared it, not wanting to risk it being ignored or dismissed. The moment it left his hands, he couldn't control what happened next, but he had faith that the right people would recognize the significance of what he had captured. Within hours, the footage began to spread. The internet, as it often does, made sure that the story reached thousands of people. News outlets began picking it up, and the reactions were immediate. People were shocked, angry, and disheartened. Social media exploded with posts about the store's behavior, and many began sharing their own stories of discrimination they had faced in similar high-end spaces. It was a chain reaction. One person's bravery in speaking out sparked a flood of voices demanding change. The man watched as the story unfolded in real time, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He knew that the owner of the store would not stay silent for long. The backlash had already begun. People began boycotting the store, with messages flooding in from individuals who had previously been loyal customers. The store's social media pages were bombarded with negative reviews, comments calling for the owner to step down, and pledges to never shop there again. It wasn't just one person's word anymore. It was a collective outcry from the community, and it was starting to take its toll. The man didn't celebrate, though. He knew that while this was a victory, it wasn't the end. The store was a well-established business, and it had the resources to fight back. There would be pushback, and the owner would likely try to downplay the situation, to spin the narrative in his favor. But the man had already taken that into account. He wasn't just waiting for something to happen. He was ready to push harder if needed. The footage had set the wheels in motion, but now he had to keep the pressure on. The next day, he was contacted by several media outlets, eager to get an interview with him. He had expected this, but he was still a bit surprised by the level of interest. He had been careful to remain anonymous, understanding that his identity wasn't the focus. It was the story that mattered. Still, the attention felt overwhelming at times. He had to remind himself that this wasn't about him, it was about the message. He agreed to an interview with a local news station, feeling that it would help push the story forward. The interview was nerve-wracking, but the man knew exactly what he wanted to say. He stuck to the facts, explaining what had happened during his visits to the store, the way he had been treated, and the footage that proved everything. He made sure to emphasize that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was part of a larger pattern of racism that existed in spaces like this, where people of color were often treated as less than. He spoke calmly, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. He knew that every word mattered. As the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. People flooded the station's website and social media pages with messages of support. Many shared their own experiences of racial discrimination, creating a powerful emotional wave of solidarity. The public pressure mounted, and the store began to feel the heat. Customers continued to pull their business away, and several high-profile figures publicly condemned the store, demanding accountability from the owner. The man, however, wasn't done yet. He knew that the owner would not back down without a fight. As more and more people spoke out against the store, the owner made his move. He released a statement attempting to justify his actions. claiming that there had been a misunderstanding, that his words had been taken out of context. But the public wasn't buying it. The footage was clear. His actions spoke louder than any words in a statement could. The man watched as the store's PR team scrambled to save face, issuing apology after apology. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The story had gone viral, and the public wasn't going to let it go. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about the broader issue of discrimination in luxury spaces, where people of color had been routinely treated as outsiders. The public's outrage wasn't just directed at the owner. It was aimed at a system that allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. The man could feel the tide turning. His efforts had started a conversation that was long overdue. People who had stayed silent about their own experiences of discrimination were now speaking out, sharing their stories and demanding change. This was no longer just about exposing one man. It was about holding an entire industry accountable for the way it treated people of color. As the days went on, more details began to surface. Reports came in from former employees, sharing their own stories of the toxic environment in the store. It turned out that the owner's racist behavior wasn't just something he had done to one person. It was something that had affected many. The man's mission had sparked a much-needed investigation into the store's practices, and as more information came to light, the pressure on the owner continued to mount. Eventually, the owner couldn't deny the public's demand for accountability. He stepped down from his position, unable to withstand the public outcry any longer. The store was left reeling, forced to close temporarily for restructuring, as they scrambled to salvage what was left of their reputation. It was a bittersweet victory. The man had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth, and in doing so, he had helped bring about real change. The store would never be the same, and neither would the people who had witnessed the injustice unfold. The man watched as the public continued to push for greater inclusivity in luxury spaces. It wasn't just about boycotting a store or shaming an owner. It was about creating a world where people of color didn't have to fear being treated unfairly. His actions had sparked something bigger than he had anticipated, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in knowing that he had played a part in it. As he looked back on the journey, the man realized that this mission had changed him too. It had made him see just how much power one individual could have when they refused to stay silent. He had taken a stand not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And in the end, that made all the difference. The aftermath of the expose was both overwhelming and satisfying. The man watched as the fallout from the footage he had shared continued to unfold. The store, once a symbol of luxury and exclusivity, was now at the center of a public scandal. The owner's racist actions, once hidden behind the gleaming displays and high-end merchandise, were now exposed for the world to see. It was a moment of triumph, but also a reminder of the long road that lay ahead. In the days that followed, the man received messages from people all over, many of them sharing their own experiences of racial discrimination in similar settings. It seemed like his story had opened a door for others to speak out about the injustices they had faced. The support was overwhelming, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He had not only completed his mission, but had sparked a much larger conversation, one that would hopefully lead to real change. He felt a sense of validation, knowing that his decision to stay calm and focused had paid off, but at the same time he knew that this was just the beginning. The fight against systemic racism in luxury retail spaces, and in society as a whole, was far from over. This one store was just a small part of a much larger issue. The man understood that even though the owner had stepped down, and the store had closed temporarily, the problem wasn't solved with one act of exposure. It was going to take more people speaking out, more action, and more accountability. The store's public apology was released, but the man saw right through it. The statement was full of empty promises, vague words about retraining staff and inclusivity efforts. It felt like damage control, nothing more than a PR move to try and save face. The public wasn't fooled. They had seen the footage, heard the owner's words, and understood that this wasn't a case of one misunderstanding. It was part of a bigger pattern that needed to be addressed, not just by this store, but by all businesses that perpetuated discriminatory practices, whether intentional or not. As more details came to light, It became clear that the owner's actions had been part of a long-standing issue in the store. Former employees spoke out about the toxic atmosphere, where employees were taught to treat certain customers as more valuable than others based on their appearance, wealth, and race. The man, hearing these stories, felt a sense of solidarity with the people who had worked there and had been subjected to this same culture of inequality. They, too, had been caught in a system that rewarded discrimination, and they had suffered in silence. But now, things were changing. The pressure was mounting and the public wasn't backing down. Social media campaigns began to rise, calling for accountability, and many customers vowed to never shop at such stores again. The man who had once entered the store as just another customer now found himself at the center of a larger movement. He had become a symbol of resistance, of someone who refused to accept the status quo. It was humbling but also empowering. The support he received was not just from people who had witnessed his ordeal, but from those who saw the broader picture. As the media coverage of the incident continued, more people came forward with their own stories. People who had been too afraid or too unsure to speak up now found the courage to do so. They shared their experiences of being treated unfairly in luxury stores, in restaurants, and even in the workplace. It was clear that the man's efforts had sparked something bigger, a ripple effect that would eventually lead to more accountability and change. One of the most powerful things to come from the exposure was the conversations that began to take place in communities. People were talking about racism in a way that hadn't happened before, at least not on such a widespread scale. People were asking themselves why this type of behavior had been allowed to continue for so long, and how they could help create a more inclusive society. It was a reminder that the fight against racism wasn't just about pointing fingers at individuals. It was about changing the systems that allowed this behavior to thrive. In the midst of all the chaos, the man took some time for himself. He had worked hard on this mission, and while he had succeeded, he needed a moment to reflect. He thought about how the whole journey had affected him. At first, it had been just about gathering evidence and exposing one man. But as the story grew, it became clear that he was part of something much bigger. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had ever been silenced by a system that didn't value them. The mission had turned into a movement, and that was something he hadn't expected. As he reflected on his actions, he also thought about the people who had been harmed by this system long before he had come along. His mission had been to expose the truth, but there were so many others who had been living this truth every day. He thought about the people who couldn't afford to go undercover, the ones who had to keep their heads down just to survive. It reminded him that while this moment of justice was important, the real work was in changing the systems that allowed discrimination to continue. One man's story wasn't enough to undo decades of inequality, but it was a start. The store eventually reopened, but it wasn't the same. The owner had stepped down, and the store was now under new management. There were promises of change, of a more inclusive environment, of better training for staff. But the man knew that it wasn't enough. Words were easy, but true change took time and effort. He hoped that this was just the beginning of a larger shift, that this incident would be a reminder to businesses everywhere that they could no longer afford to ignore the voices of the marginalized. In the months that followed, the store began to make changes, but it was clear that the public's trust would not be easily restored. The store's customer base had shrunk, and it was going to take a long time for them to rebuild. But the man didn't feel bad about that. He knew that sometimes businesses had to feel the consequences of their actions in order to truly understand the gravity of the situation. The community's outrage wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message that racism, in any form, would not be tolerated. The man, now a quiet but powerful figure in the fight for racial equality, continued his life but with a new sense of purpose. He knew that this victory, though significant, was only one chapter in a much longer story. He had done his part, but the fight wasn't over. There were still other stores, other businesses, and other people who needed to be held accountable for their actions. He had started something, but there was much more to do. He looked at his phone, scrolling through the messages of thanks and support that continued to pour in. It was clear that his actions had made a difference, that his willingness to stand up and speak out had sparked a conversation that was long overdue. But the work wasn't done. Not yet.